Can you feel the coercive, controlling love of God in this Chili's? Today, we're going to be considering whether or not love can ever be controlling. Specifically, we're going to be looking at this through the lens of the character Killgrave, aka Mr. Purple, in the Alias comics and Jessica Jones television series. We're going to have a blast. We're going to get deep. It's going to be wild. I can't wait for this. We are the Priest to the Geeks. I'm Joshua Knoll, and I am here with the wondrous pastor of Holy Trinity Lutheran Church in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, the one and only Pastor Will Rose. How's it going?
Great, guys. Glad we're here. What a cool topic. Can't wait to dive in.
And usually I use hyperbole here, but I'm going to tell you guys the truth for once. This conversation was actually inspired by the guest and former host, the beautiful and handsome Nick Polk. How's it going?
Dude, I'm so good, especially when Pastor Will pulls out the shaka, when we're talking about freaking... I'm ready. Talking about Jessica Jones, I'm ready.
Double shaka.
Man, yeah. This is one I do think is, it'll be good on the podcast, but you guys should check it out on YouTube if you haven't, because this is going to be a YouTube-friendly episode. If you're on a laptop, please consider rating and reviewing our show on Podchaser or on Good Pods. That's going to help our show gain recognition, make it easier to find, show in other search engines, that kind of stuff. Algorithms. Trust us, bro. Totally sources. If you're on your phone, please consider rating, reviewing, or commenting on our show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, because that helps us prioritize the show in those apps specifically, which is what most people who listen to the podcast use. So, yeah, thank you in advance for your support. Free support is great, and it doesn't even take that much time, so we appreciate you guys spending a little bit of time to help our show out. And, of course, we also thank our supporters who do throw a little cash at us. We give them little teases here and there over on Apple Podcasts, Captivate, and Patreon when they throw money at us. And we want to especially thank the one and only Russell Gentry. Thank you for supporting the show. You rock. And remember, guys, if you want your own shout-out, you too can support our show for $3 a month on one of those three platforms, Apple Podcasts, Captivate, or Patreon. All right, guys. Will, what are we geeking out on before we get into the episode? Where are you at?
Man, it is a good time to be a TV fan. There's so many cool shows that are out there right now, like Abbott Elementary, White Lotus, Daredevil, Righteous Gemstones next season came on, and/or season 2's right around the corner. But one thing that I am totally geeking out on, I still need to watch the finale, is Paradise on Hulu. Sterling K. Brown, incredible TV show. I heard about it through the grapevine, then we started watching it. I'm totally hooked. It is unbelievably good. If you haven't started watching, it's only 8 episodes, but man, it's so good. It's hard to not just like binge it all the way through. I have one more. It's out there. It's been out there a while, but the finale.
We'll always trying to make every geeking out on into a lightning round. That's what he's trying to do.
I did it. It's just a good time. But Paradise is the TV show that I'm most geeking out about right now.
All right. I'll go next. Give Nick as much time as possible. Think about his what he's geeking out on, so he can share with us. I'm geeking out on relevant to this episode. Actually, it's a series that came out last year that I forgot to finish. I started it, and then stuff happened at my house, and then moving, and all this stuff happened. But it's Rivals. It's a Hulu series starring David Tennant. It's fantastic. He's not quite as evil on that one as he's in what we're going to be talking about today. But he's pretty darn close. It's just evil billionaires. Great stuff. It's so much fun. Lots of drama and connivingness. It's
fiction. It's fiction.
Mostly. It's mostly fiction. It's about like the beginning of the broadcasting world, But anyway, also here with the one, the only, beautiful Nick. What beautiful items have you been geeking out on?
Man, I keep hearing about Paradise, and I need to watch it, as well as David Tennant as a villain in anything. And David Tennant in anything is amazing, God, but so David Tennant as a villain is so good. Currently, really, the thing that I've been geeking out on lately has been on various versions of universalism. So I just presented a paper on Tolkien and Christian universalism. So that has been something I have been doing a deep dive into. And I am hopefully going to be back into doing some more pop cultural geeking out since I'm finished with that.
Where can I get a hold of that paper if I wanted to? Do I have to just like email?
Yeah, you can have it, and
Yeah.
I'll probably submit it to the Journal of Tolkien Research, which is a open source journal online.
Ooh.
So that'll probably be on there at some point.
Ooh, fun. And
I
if
like a piece of that too. I like a piece of
Yeah.
that too. Zap it my way.
yeah,
Oh,
and if you're on
I
YouTube
got
and
you.
you heard my phone ringtone and noticed my T-shirt, of course I'm also geeking out on Kingdom Hearts. Yeah, always. I actually, I'm going to move on from this, but briefly because this is funny. I actually had the other day where, because of the weird world that I live in now, my wife was like, "Why are you're in bed and you're still playing Kingdom Hearts?" And ironically, this time I was actually doing it for school because part of my dissertation is gonna specifically have to do with Kingdom Hearts and how it has to do with politic philosophy. So.
Ooh,
Man,
that's what I'm
Yeah.
talking about.
Well, it's funny because I had to submit like three different ones for them to choose from, and I thought of two really like solid topics, and I couldn't think of a good third one. So I was like, let me just put something silly out there that I know they won't pick, and then they chose that, and I was like, sick. Kingdom Hearts semester, here we go. Anyway, on to the actual topic. Today we're going to be talking about Nick Polk. Will and I sometimes we just get together and we geek out about Nick's beard, Nick's Tolkien writings, his Substack. We just talk about Nick a lot, and that's what we're here to talk about. We are actually
non-coercive beard. It's a non-coercive beard.
yeah, a non-coercive, loving beard. No, but in honesty though, this episode actually was inspired by a series of books that Nick was a part of. It is Amipotence, sort of by Thomas Jay Oord, about Thomas Jay Oord's philosophy of amipotence. Nick, help me out. Could you unpack what these books are and just tell us a little bit about how you contributed to this? And yeah, for those wondering, we did an episode on Whole Church Together. There was a panel with us, Thomas Jay Oord, Aaron Simmons, Josh Patterson. All you guys who aren't me contributed to this. And what you wrote inspired today's episode. And then later on Whole Church Podcast, I'm going to plug my other show. We are going to, me, Thomas Jay Oord, and Josh Patterson are going to review this podcast we're recording right now. So we're recording for an episode of 2, perhaps 3.
Oh man, they're gonna
Yeah.
be listening to this and then responding to us.
Yeah. We're gonna review this. I'm reviewing this. What you guys say
Hey,
is
Tom.
up for review.
Hey Josh. Great. Love you guys.
Nick, tell us about this.
Future Josh,
Amipotence.
hello.
Future will.
Yeah, future Josh, you're looking good. Better than me. Better than me, I'd like to say. Yeah.
So for those who don't know, amipotence is this concept developed by Tom Oord, which is this idea that God's power is not primarily controlling or coercive or just all encompassing, but it is informed by a non-coercive love. And so it's love power, essentially, is what the word means. And so these 2 volumes, because Tom is a man of integrity, he wanted to collect a bunch of essays that responded to his concept, both support as well as criticism. And so the 2 first volume is where I'm in because I support Tom's concept of amipotence. I am fond of that idea and tend to lean that direction. And so I'm in the support and criticism under the support section of that book. Mine is the decline. My essay is called "The Decline of Pop Culture" or Omnipotence. I'm sorry, the decline of omnipotence in pop culture, which I think will be really exciting. Talking about with Jessica Jones, and then the second volume is just taking it. There's people who respond where they expand on Tom's idea, where they're like, hey, this is cool, but here's where it could be taken. And then other people actually apply it, where they're like, hey, let's take a theological amipotence and see what it looks like as a pastor or a therapist, etc. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, Tom writes a book, The Death of Omnipotence, The Birth of Amipotence. And then he gets these 2 books to respond to that book. And then we did an episode responding to that. And now we're doing an episode responding to that episode, responding to this, responding to the original book. And I'm going to do an episode responding to this. Yeah.
So it's like a Groundhog Day time loop. Is that what we're doing?
I feel like it's like early church council almost, except for like we don't have to meet in person these days. We're all just like bouncing these ideas around and like workshopping it. It's like, hey, is this good? Is this
quicker.
bad? How can we make it work? Yeah.
We have the tech
It's
of-
definitely quicker. But so Nick, you mentioned you wrote in the support section what you wrote inspired some of this. Could you kind of explain what you wrote in there? Just a little bit of like what your take was, other than just yay good. Because I like
so
that, but
I kind of try to analyze specifically superhero IPs, through My Hero Academia, The Boys, Invincible, those type of kind of recent popular shows, and I talk about how like through those things, through those IPs, pop culture is kind of skeptical of all controlling power. And I think that there's a sort of implication there where people generally are not fond of omnipotence, and also think that omnipotence is a farce, or if it exists, it is corrupting. And so I basically just wrote about how we can trace this um, dissatisfaction with omnipotence in our pop culture all IPs that deal specifically with powerful characters.
Yeah. So with that, you kind of wrote about some of these heroes, air quotes, who have all power and how they're actually not necessarily the best for society or culture. And then we were talking, I was trying to like in the other episode on the whole church, I was trying to like respond to all of you guys, like what I agreed with, what I thought, was trying to push back a little bit, and trying to shoehorn myself into the conversation. And I was like, Nick, what's funny is like I couldn't think of anything to criticize with Nick because Nick's always right. We have a Nick Polk cult on the show for those who've listened to our Dead Space episodes. But like I remember I was just like, why didn't you talk about Mr. Purple? And then I was like, wait a minute, we could still do that. So we're here. We're here to talk about Killgrave, Mr. Purple, and specifically we're going to be looking at the Alias comics as well as the Jessica Jones TV series. So he, for those who don't know, not a hero, not an all-powerful hero, but he's pretty darn close to an all-powerful villain. And we're going to be looking at some of that. And of course, if we're going to have that conversation, we're talking about comic books. We have to have the ultimate comic book pastor. Will Rose join us.
The master.
Yeah.
Ultimate Will. Ultimate Will.
So Will, I need your help. I need your help. Can
Sacred
you
timeline Will
help us understand a little bit going into this? For those who don't know, this is like R-rated comics, right? Could you unpack a little bit, like, because to understand Alias, the graphic novel, the omnibus comics, whatever, you kind of have to know like what happened with Marvel, the Comics Code Authority, and then what the Max Comics line were. So could you kind of just break down some of that as far as like the history of comics, where this falls?
Sure, and we're going to get into Jessica Jones a little bit later in terms of where she shows up in comics later, or you want to?
Yeah. Right now we're just talking about that. Just following the outline and being very meta.
The outline in front of me. No, and kind of going back to Nick a little bit, to chime in a little bit about kind of like, as a pastor, when people say like, oh, do you believe in God? Or, before they find out I'm a pastor, you say, well, what do you mean by God? And let's parse that out a little bit, define the terms. And then I think same way with love. It's like, I believe in love. Well, what kind of love do you believe in? Right. And so even though scripture describes God is love in a pretty clear sentence there in scripture, what is God? Who is God? What's God's character? What is love? What kind of love are we talking about? There's all kinds of Greek and Hebrew words for different types of love. And I think describing God's power, sovereignty, I think there's room to talk about the kind of love that we mean when we talk about love. And there's room for that discussion. And so I'm glad that Tom and our process friends are thinking through that when it comes to, stereotypes of God or pop culture understanding of God and power and love and those things. So, and I think in our pop culture, that it helps us process those things because we're creating stories with heroes and villains and plots and conflict and whether the story ends with a happily ever after or whether it's going to continue to go on because there's trauma involved and iron this. And we as humans use story as a means, as a theopoetic way to iron these things out. So why not in superhero comics and sci-fi, fantasy, those kinds of things. So it makes sense that we're working the character of love, the character of sovereignty or power, and what we do with those gifts or tools through the stories we tell.
Yeah. since we're responding to it and adding, I will let our listeners know, since maybe not all of them are going to go listen to Whole Church. I don't fully get on board with Tom's idea. I like it. I think my biggest pushback was his thing against omnipotence with all power. And my thing was more, a lot of his arguments, from what I can tell, seems like he's trying to argue against how much power God has by explaining what type of power God has. And I think it's just two separate arguments. You can have all power or no power, and that doesn't necessarily mean anything about what kind of power you have. So that's where I fall on that. If you want a little bit more on that take, you can go listen to that episode on Whole Church. It was a lot of fun, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more in the next episode in Whole Church, reviewing this episode.
And Tom does say that Josh's critique is a valid. And
Yeah.
is valid. So.
I was validated. Yeah.
What?
And Tom
you're
invited
validated
me
by Tom.
to OrtCon this summer, and I think I might actually go. I might go to OrtCon this year. That'd be
Hey,
weird.
that's cool.
Yeah. I might be like a fish out of water, but that's how I was with the first theology beer camp. I've come a long way, so maybe I'll have more further to go. We'll see.
You can learn to swim.
Yeah.
You can learn to swim.
Yeah, I'll
Joshua.
figure it out.
I believe in you. Okay, so comics. Yeah, so whether I'm trying not to go all the way back to early humans who are doing cave painting drawings to articulate a story or a narrative or meaning to their lives. We've been doing comics since we could utter a first grunt to communicate how we're feeling about something, and so we've been painting on cave walls and drawing and art and poetry and songs around campfires. Eventually get there's a long time in between there, but eventually get to iconography and stained glass and literacy and books and all those things. So if you look at stained glass in your church windows, or go back to Greek orthodoxy with iconography, they're just telling a story through graphic means, graphic novels on the walls to tell the hero stories of the saints of the day and the villains of the day, and virtue will triumph. So here we go. Comics going back to the early 1900s. And whether it's Superman, Batman, DC, Captain America, well, eventually get to the 1940s, and the Comics Code Authority makes its debut because they're worried about juvenile delinquency. And what's contributing to juvenile delinquency? You know what's doing it? These crazy comics. They're kind of horror and graphic images and sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Man, we can't do that. So let's put a code on it, a rating system, so parents can be warned, or they can see whatever their child is reading is approved by the Comic Codes Authority.
To be fair to the idea, I would be very upset to see a child reading Ice Cream Man. And it does sound like, if you hear Ice Cream Man, it sounds kid friendly. So
right.
Yeah,
Right.
I get
And
it. I get the idea.
Yeah, sometimes the Comics Code Authority gets shit on a lot, and yeah, it's kind of this authoritative means by which to kind of regulate what kids are seeing and doing. But sure, yeah, there's a reason, like you put explicit lyrics on some hip hop albums, or you have a rating system for movies. You just walk in, you don't want your 5-year-old going to see a Saw movie. I fully understand that.
Yeah.
So eventually you get to way Marvel and DC kind of got around the Comics Code Authority is to do their own imprints. And so eventually Marvel in 2001 said, you know what, we're going to do our own thing. We're going to do an imprint called Marvel Max Comics. So it's rated R comics, a little bit more explicit, a little bit more violent, a little bit, don't care about cuss words. You don't have to bleep out things or that kind of stuff. So they do their own kind of more mature comics for a more mature audience. And DC was already kind of doing that with their Vertigo line when it comes to Swamp Thing and Sandman and Doom Patrol, that kind of stuff. And here Marvel did this. And with the debut of Marvel Max Comics in 2001, they you have Brian Michael Bendis, who was kind of their premier creator at the time, created Alias, Jessica Jones, to kind of really launch and kick off this Marvel Max imprint. And at the late 90s, early 2000s, comics hit a ceiling. They went bankrupt. The comics craze of the 90s just really ran out of steam. And there's a lot that goes into that history, but Marvel almost declared bankruptcy and almost shut their doors until they just kind of put it back in the creators' hands and say, what kind of comics do you want to tell? And some of this, Alias, Marvel Max, Punisher, more gritty, hardcore comics came to the forefront, and it was a big hit. People were like, "Yep, the kids that grew up on comics in the 80s and 90s were ready in their 20s and 30s and early 40s to jump into rated R comics."
Yeah. Well, I want to break down a little bit, since you already mentioned Jessica Jones' Alias. This was one of the, it was just Alias originally. Now it's Jessica Jones' Alias. Anyway, one of the original Max comics. I talk a little bit, some of like the backdrop of all this, like with her, because you mentioned Bendis. One of the fun things is originally Alias was going to be Jessica Drew, because she, in this time of comic book history, lost all of her superpowers, and like, this is a perfect opportunity. She used to be a detective, and then as they were telling the story, they realized like, no, this, if we want this to be, they wanted it to be part of Earth 616, the regular Marvel storyline, and a lot of the other Max ones weren't. So to make this work, if they wanted to keep it in universe, they had to create a new character, because what happens to this character if it happened to Jessica Drew? It couldn't be the same Jessica Drew. There was just no way to do it.
And Jessica Drew being Spider-Woman, who was connected, had her own cartoon, her own comic, part of the Avengers, connected to Peter Parker. You have a Spider-Man, you have a Spider-Woman. So, that's kind of her backstory.
Yeah,
So
but she has no spider powers like Spider-Man, though. Like, it's a whole different thing. It's random. It's weird. Which I found out playing Marvel. What was it called? Marvel Ultimate Alliance. Yeah, that's when I found out. I was like, oh, Spider-Woman. It's going to be Spider-Man, but a woman. That'll be cool. And then I was like, nope. Anyway, I forgot where I was now. Give me a second. Give me a second now. Man. Okay, yeah. So what was cool, though, is whenever they brought this character to light, they wanted her to exist. So they kind of shoehorned her in. So you'll see these references to Avengers and different stuff. And even in later Spider-Man comics and stuff, they'll be like, oh, yeah, you remember when she was in high school with me? And if you look back, yeah, she just did not exist before Alias, and Marvel decided she should have. So now she does. That's how that works.
Yeah, it's classic recon, right? One
of the few times retcons work, though.
It worked. Yeah, like it created a character and then said, oh, she was there all along. She was a superhero jewel who could fly and had super strength and had super durability. And yeah, she was. See that person sitting in the classroom with Peter Parker behind him in the third row on that one comic way back when? That's Jessica Jones. You're like, oh, cool. Why not? And but Bendis was so good at dialogue and character development, and he was behind Ultimate Spider-Man and that new launch of the Ultimate Universe. He was behind all that, and really their premier creator at the time, so we're not let him run with this. Eventually brought her in to the Avengers, New Avengers, her relationship with Luke Cage and Power Man. They had a kid together. She became Power Woman. I mean, all kinds of just a new creative, cool new character for Marvel there in the 2000s that led into a lot of big relaunches. And eventually you get to the TV, and when Netflix is doing this kind of series, street level superhero, the MCU was, and it's starting to emerge and be a whole
We're not
thing.
there yet.
Oh, you want me to talk about like her Jessica Jones in the TV?
We're not, but we can.
Okay.
We can, but we're going to go to that later on as well. So I didn't know if you wanted to.
Go with it.
Yeah. I just know we got a few more stuff on the comics, so I didn't want to get caught up. So we're gonna run through the next few things pretty quick, so we don't end up all the stuff on the front end and miss all the cool stuff on the back end of this conversation. But first, since you already brought up the show and the comic, there's a lot of differences, but what there are some similarities in is like kind of the premise of the story, like just the bare bones of it. So, Will, since you are the knowledge man, the magic head, if you will, could you, I don't know, maybe just give us like the premise for those who are like, what is Jessica Jones? Who's Mr. Purple? What's this have to do with all that Amipotence stuff that y'all mentioned earlier? Maybe just kind of fill in what the premise of this story is when it comes to Mr. Purple and Jessica Jones specifically.
In the comics?
Both. There's like I would think that the two share a premise.
Yeah. Oh, I was just going to get, okay. Yeah, because I think right now it's hard to separate between comics and TV because of what she's known. So in the comics, Bendis did have her as a private investigator, kind of backstory. She experienced some trauma, and she was just kind of like a noir detective series. Up when you get to, I think it was a couple you have the first couple volumes of Alias. It's just her being a detective, but eventually get to this Mr. Purple Killgrave storyline where basically mind control power. Killgrave. Let me see if I can find like he's a different name in the comics than he is in the TV show. So Zebediah Killgrave, who appeared in Daredevil issue 4, 1964, he's the long-term villain in the Marvel universe in terms of this guy who has the power of suggestion, the power psycho powers of controlling your psyche, your mind, power. Whatever he says, he can make you do, which is a pretty powerful. Power, and then if you're not in your own right mind, you use that to manipulate others to do your own bidding. So yeah, even the purest of heart would have a hard time resisting what they have to do if they could control people around them. And eventually it gets around to this storyline of Jessica being controlled for his own pleasure and doing and ego when it comes to Mr. Purple. Didn't know what else you wanted to do there in the comics.
Yeah. No, just the comics in the show, just talking about like the general premise. And I think that's basically it. You know, she ends up a detective, ex-superhero. Yeah, Killgrave, Mr. Purple, has the ability to control people, causes terrible things. Yeah, I think that's pretty clear that this episode's already going to be explicit because there's no way to talk about this without it. And the pastor already said shit, so here we are. There's a lot of conversation around rape and sexual assault and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So you just can't not be explicit when you're talking about that. Like, there's no real way to do that. So that's what we're talking about. And that comes up in the show as well as the comics. I think it's made a little bit more explicitly clear in the show, but it does exist in both. In both of them, there's a reference to him making her watch him rape somebody else. So it's kind of like you want to talk about an awful bad guy. It's one of those, like, you know, like everybody can be like, oh yeah, I like Killgrave. Killgrave's a cool bad guy. I don't think anyone in the right mind feels comfortable saying they like Mr. Purple. David Tennant's betrayal, amazing. Incredible how he does that. But there's no way to be like, oh yeah, that's a good bad guy. I like him. Nah. It's just not really a character anybody like relates to. Not like,
And if you create a villain, you know, a super villain, it makes a difference what their kind of power. Like you have Doctor Doom, you have Thanos. What are they after? They're after control. They're after power. They want to rule everything. And when Killgrave, Mr. Purple, shows up on the last page of a cliffhanger comic book, you're like, oh crap, it's about to happen. Or to explain what's going on within the comics, why people are doing what they're doing out of character, then Purple Man is one of those up at the top that like, yeah, you should be scared of him. Similar to like Joker and other characters when they show up. If you're intimidated and scared, well, you should be, because he's got a pretty awful power set.
Yeah. So going back to drilling in a little bit more to the comic part of it, Will, I know you like to do this. So who do you want to mention? Who do you want to cred for the Alias series? We mentioned Bendis. Is there any artists, letters, anything like that you want to shout out?
Oh yeah. There the artist, where's his name? Michael Gaydos, Gaydos.
Yeah.
Definitely he's the guy that was kind of on there. There's definitely, you know, with all the artists with the Max series with Marvel, they pick really gritty, kind of shadowy noir kind of artists and storytelling. But yeah, I think there's Bendis really helped form that, and then the artists that he chose to come along with them were definitely the right picks when it comes to expressing and putting the story and images on the page for us. But Bendis is very wordy. You know, he has a lot of talking heads. He's not known for his action sequences. A lot of people, a lot of talking heads on his pages, just because he's so good at dialogue and characterization. So, yeah, that's what he does with his comics.
Yeah. All right, so let's jump in. Still heavy on the comic side. I don't know if Nick had anything he wanted to chime in with, but. We read this whole thing and watched this series in preparation for this. This has been an episode a long time in the making, like a month or so. Nick, as far as like when you read this, were there any like connections to other Marvel heroes and stuff that you were kind of surprised by reading the Alias comics?
It was more just like how the references in the TV show were like allusions to the comic, you know. It's always those things where, like, because I watched the TV, you know, I did the whole Defenders thing on when it was originally Netflix.
Yeah, and, so good.
You know, had not read any of the Max stuff, really, I mean, like I said, I think the only real comic series I ever read was the Gore Butcher stuff that y'all suggested to me a few years
So good.
ago.
Yeah.
And so I was just kind of riding the little TV MCU there. Um, and so I think it really was just more about like, oh, I recognize, you know, that from this illusion, the jewel costume, from the first season and things like
Yeah.
that. And then, then to the Spider-Man stuff and things. And then even learning about how Mr. Purple was connected to Daredevil first.
Yeah.
Because in Jessica Jones TV show, you think that it's like a Jessica Jones original villain, when you
Yeah.
first watch it.
Yeah, which I think since the Alias comics drops, I think even most comic book readers, when you think of Mr. Purple, you probably do first think of Jessica Jones now because that story was just so impactful. Like it's almost like for me, and we'll talk more about it here in a minute, I guess. But like the old ones that I've read with him, and like Daredevil or the X-Men, or like even when he showed up in other places, it was always like, oh, Mr. Purple, that's a fun, silly, fun, silly bad guy. And then like you read this and you're like, no, not a fun, silly bad guy. And that's where like I think it went from like we all called him Mr. Purple to now like it doesn't like it feels weird calling him Mr. Purple because that's such a silly name that you're like I feel like I have to call him Killgrave.
And there's other analogies too with other villains, like with whether it's Thanos or even Joker. Like Joker was just a silly clown, right? Who made jokes or made like weird things come out of gun. I don't know. Like I think as we've matured as a medium, comics have made a medium. Some of these villains have gone darker and darker and darker and darker as we think about the world we live in and things like that. So along Mr. Purple. Yeah, just a kind of a villain. Oh, isn't it fun? Stan Lee's like, oh, cool. Someone was like, can control your mind. Oh no, how are you going to get out of this tight one this week? Daredevil friends, Spidey friends. But then eventually you can really go like what Bendis does in this Mech series, go really dark. And I think the same way with like Joker, he was one of Batman's villains. But man, you get Scott Snyder on a Joker book, and you're like, that's the scariest thing I've ever read. So yeah, there's some analogies there in terms of how we go.
Yeah, yeah. Apologize to everyone. The dog's about to be loud. But that's what happens. We're podcasters in the real world, as Will likes to say. What's fun though, my first connection with Mr. Purple that I wanted to bring up, because I don't know if you guys have any like Nick kind of mentioned his first introduction was kind of through the show, and I'm sure when Will gets to like her connection to other Marvel heroes, we'll hear about his history, helping Stan Lee come up with the idea for Mr. Purple or something. But my first was really random. It was playing the role-playing game Champions, which is like D&D but for superheroes. And everybody had to have a weakness, and you had to choose your own nemesis. Like who was your nemesis? And most people like create their own thing, but there are places on the internet where you can like find like Spider-Man's Champions paper or whatever. And one of the guys I played with, he decided his weakness was literally the color purple and made his nemesis Mr. Purple. And that's why, like, I think early on, I was like, oh, what a silly bad guy. Oh, he can control minds, but it's like, ooh, purple. And now I'm like, oh, no, that was just him being silly. That is not the character necessarily being a silly character. But yeah, so we mentioned Spider-Man connection. I have, like, Captain America above me, been drinking my coffee out of a Captain America cup, all that good stuff. So for me, like, one of the big connections, obviously, is, like, she discovers Captain America's identity, because this was back before it was, like, widely known, I guess. That part was still weird to me, but whatever. She dates Scott Lang, aka Ant-Man. We see this reference to Spider-Man here, but as you mentioned, like she first was Daredevil, was Mr. Purple, is where he was first seen, and then later we see him like X-Men, different stuff like that. Will fill us in on all the gaps. Me and Nick touched everything we can. Fill in the gaps. What are the connections to the Jessica Jones, Mr. Purple, and the rest of the Marvel stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think when a creator is trying to figure out to write their own story, there's some big stories with the big time superheroes and villains. But then if you want to, if you're going to get creative as a writer, what's going to give you passion and the creative juices to keep going? You might pick a deep cut villain and run with it. So Bendis, ran with Purple Man and Killgrave and Mind Control, and she's a detective. She's a great detective. She can figure things out. She has her own problems, drinking problems, and it's a noir storytelling. You come into her office, and she's got to figure out the crime and figure out private investigating. But one thing I discovered through leading up to this pod is that there was a graphic novel called Emperor Doom, where Doom harnesses the power of Mr. Purple Killgrave so that he can take over and mind control whoever he wants and whoever he's around in the entire world. And so if we think the present day comic book One World Under Doom, where he's the Sorcerer Supreme and he's taken over the world because he's a sorcerer, well, this has been done before in Emperor Doom in 1987. So I didn't know of this until I've been started reading it. And basically this thing we're seeing here is that he's revealing to Namor in this picture that he has one hair from Killgrave and put it in this psychoprism, and he can now control those around him and those around the world. So it's pretty fun. Like the opening scene to this graphic novel is, Mr. Purple basically, feet up on a beach on vacation, and the people around him observing him because he can control them, make them do whatever he wants. But then some dark figure snatches him, kidnaps him. He's like, "No, not you." Well, probably Dr. Doom. And then now he's using him, manipulating him, so that he can use and manipulate other people as well.
Yeah, which also, because that's a fun reference that reminds me of this is like well after Alias and all that, but like a couple years ago there was a comic that I think the new Daredevil series is building off of, Devil's Reign, and it's revealed in that part of how Kingpin becomes the mayor in the comics. I don't know if this could be a spoiler. I doubt it's going to be a spoiler for the show, but plug your ears if you want. Part of how it works though is Kingpin has Mr. Purple in a contraption and is using it to control like all of New York. And you're like, oh, so it's fun watching this because I'm like, oh, Daredevil originally was Mr. Purple, was Daredevil. And here we have Kingpin controlling New York, being mayor, and it's because he captured Mr. Purple. And now I'm like, man, all these characters making it to the MCU. I gotta say, I highly doubt this happens, but if I see David Tennant in a cage somewhere in like Kingpin's office in one of these episodes, I will lose my ever-loving mind.
Right.
That would be that would be too cool. They can't do that. It would be too cool. My heart would give out and everyone would be sad. But okay, so as far as like the comics go, we mentioned some of the connections and stuff that it has. Are there any like specific panels or anything that like parts of this story that stood out from the comics that really add to some of the themes that we're talking about here for you guys? Control, abuse, mental health, even. What stands out? Nick, you go first. We've done so much talking. Nick needs to talk.
I think really the way that the watching part that he makes her do in the comics, like you said, in the story, in the TV show, it's more explicit how like perverted he is. I guess it's just easier to interpret, whereas in the Alias stuff it's just very, just like any written material, you have to like put the pieces together. And the way how dark it is, I feel like that panel specifically, explaining that was like dark, dude. Like I was like, this is dark. And I had no idea what the Max comic run was. I just picked up Alias and then did research later, and I was like, oh, okay, that's why it's so freaking dark. And I don't think it's translated I don't think the darkness is translated in the same way in the TV show, because they're still trying to keep like the kind of quippy, fun MCU type of banter in there in the vibes. But yeah,
it's weird how like the rape itself is less explicit in the comic and yet it's darker. I think a lot of it has to do with like the coloring. Because like in comics, you could see like where the one guy manipulates her out on the golf course. It's all like the brighter colors, and you're like, okay, this is like, that prep boy. He was definitely in a fraternity. Now he's in like a golf club, and you're like, okay, this is that kind of person. And then like you see the really dark colors here, whereas in a show, you're filming. Like you can do some stuff to make it darker, but you don't have as much control over coloring in a film situation, I think, as you do literally if you're just drawing it. So I think that's how that kind of that's for me. That's why I thought that. But I definitely agree. Like it's definitely darker and yet somehow less explicit. So you're like, huh?
Yeah.
I mean, I think when you're translating from book to film, you're like, oh, why'd they leave that part out of the film? That's my favorite part of the book, And the same way with like graphic novels, you have the storyboard already ready for you to kind of go off and go. But I think how, the use of art and shadows and just the darkness of the art, using dark colors and shadows, it really is kind of where Bendis thrives. The talking, the panel to panel, the turning the page, the cliffhangers, and there wasn't one specific panel that kind of stood out for me, other than just kind of you see their facial expressions, you feel the emotion coming out of the page, and yeah, this is serious stuff, and you kind of feel sorry for Killgrave because he's looking for something. Does he know whether people really like him for who he is or not, or he's just controlling them? He's looking for authentic love and connection, but he can't resist using his power to control others to get what he really wants, and it's a vicious cycle. And that's kind of what's at the heart of behind this entire episode that we're talking about, what we're all longing for and wishing we could have.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what's interesting too. I think in comics, the end in the show, like he doesn't necessarily get to say, "Okay, now I'm using my power to control you, and now I'm just talking to you and not using it." It's like, no. If he were just into a certain way, you just have him like he's always having to think about it. And I think Gat gets brought out a little bit more in the show, so I'll talk more about that later. But one of the things that stood out with me in the comic, rereading it this time, I don't think I noticed it the first time, but having gone through some deconstruction and met a lot of people who've been hurt by the church, I'm reading this going, holy shit, like this is what people go through, right? Like you see pastors who manipulated you, and sometimes even there are situations where it was rape, but it wasn't like forced upon you because like, their control, their position of power, all this kind of stuff happens, and you feel like you should do these things, and you're like, oh, looking back on it, you're like, oh, that's what happened to me. Like even myself, like nothing explicit like that happened to me, but I look back and I'm like, I taught stuff I didn't agree with. I did certain things that I'm like not really proud of, and it's because like I look back and I was like, because people who were my pastor told me that was okay and that's what we should be doing, right? And then like I'm like looking back on it, going, oh, I was being controlled but didn't know it because they put their position of authority. And you see some really clear parallels with that. I don't think that's what the intention was with the comic. Like I don't think Bendis has any religious trauma that I'm aware of, but it's hard not reading this and not seeing that in our current world, like reading it through the lens of the world we live in. And then like all of her, like, not like, it's not like she despises superheroes, but like that trauma makes her not want to connect with these other superhero groups, to not be part of the Avengers and other storylines, all this other kind of stuff. And I'm looking at it going, oh no, I get that. Like sometimes it is like, if it wasn't for like how different the Lutheran Church feels, I'm not sure I would want to go, and like theology beer camp, that's something we're all a part of. Like that's that for a lot of people. We're like, we still want that community, but going into a church is really hard for a lot of people because of some traumas and stuff like that. So I think you see a lot more of that in the comic, where like she's just a lot more hesitant to approach superheroes because of what some of the other stuff she's gone through, the trauma that she holds with that.
Well, it also mirrors. Sorry, no, I was just going to say before I forget. It mirror. If you think about when this debuted, the early 2000s, post 9/11, 2001. There's a lot of distrust in institutions and authority and religion as itself, as being okay. There's a step back to say, all right, let's re-examine what this is and let's deconstruct it and reconstruct it. And the same thing was happening within superheroes and institutions. So whether it's post Dark Knight Returns or Watchmen, then you have the early 2000s and you have these deconstruction of superheroes, more gritty superhero stories about the institution of the team and what superheroes are experiencing, and you have Civil War, who's the villain, who's the hero, we don't know. It's all blurred, and Bendis is tapping into this kind of early 2000s deconstruction of all things. And so the church was a part of that. You have the emergent church emerging around that time because people are second guessing a lot of things that are just being done to them when they were kids. And so I think this goes right along. Art imitating life imitating art is right there, and entangled with each other. If you get to say Kingdom Hearts a lot, I could say entangled a lot. They're entangled. Well,
and if you want to know what this comic said, we talk about explicit, and I think if you, I don't swear. I feel like I don't swear a lot, but one of the things I think that this comic, and it's one of those things you could just do in literature that it's harder to do in a show, that it does really well. It's like when you look at the kind of trauma she faced, not just sexual, but also with superhero community, all this other stuff. The fact that the first volume, the very first word, and like if you're doing it by graphic novel, that first like arc of the story, the last word of that first arc is the same as the first word, and it expresses perfectly. It's just fuck. And like I feel like you feel it from the depths of her soul when you read that, and I'm like, yeah, that's just how so many people feel, and I think it was used well here. Nick, yeah, you were going to say something. I don't know what it was. I'm trying to transition into it though.
No, I kind of just piggyback on what y'all said of just like the implicit skepticism of just authority in general, as Will kind of talked about, but just more of like how authority was generally identity based, right? Where it was like, oh, it didn't matter to a certain extent what the quality of the authority was for a long time, but what was the identity of it? American authority obviously is the best authority. The church authority is the best authority, right? Less than
Yeah.
the actual quality behind it. And then what you were saying, Josh, too, about I think the show does, like you said, there's less hesitancy towards like team up, I guess, maybe than in the comics. But I think we really see in the show this hesitancy for Jessica to get into superhero work because the main experience of power dynamics that she has is through abuse. And like whenever she exercises her powers, she gets like this close to hurting innocent people. And I think that's also part of the hesitancy where like power is generally patriarchal, right, in our societies for the past forever. And now we're seeing power being explored through a woman character. And what does that look like?
Yeah. Well, man, good stuff. So we're now about the halfway mark, and we're going to talk about the show. We're not halfway. I think we've talked some about the show already. We're just going to rehash some of this because I do want to focus a little bit on what is said in the show that's different. So I'll throw it to you guys. What differences did you guys notice in the show, having watched it, that maybe wasn't in the comic or wasn't? We've talked some about already what was kind of emphasized differently. But yeah, what do you guys think about the show?
I think the death of Killgrave in the show just seems
Yeah.
to be more like, I don't know, I felt like more excited about that, which obviously in the other comics, and for not spoiling later stuff in the Devil's Reign or whatever, but what happens to Kilgrave in the show is obviously different.
Yeah.
And I think the overall vibes that we feel from the show are different too.
Yeah. Well, and it's kind of cool. As much as I kind of hope now that it's technically is in the MCU, that maybe they'll do some weird like this didn't really happen kind of stuff, because I want more David Tennant in my life. But what was cool about having him die in the show was in later seasons you see him you see that post trauma, like what happens post trauma, where like even though he's dead, he's not really out of her life. So I liked how they did that as well. Will, did you have any thoughts specifically on like the show part of this?
No, just that it's more compressed. I mean, I think you read the graphic novels. It takes you a while to get to Killgrave in that storyline, but that's the first one they do in season 1 because that's the one that you can pull in most things. And as we talked about, like you had the MCU, but the Netflix before there was Disney Plus and streaming. You had Netflix that did these kind of street level superheroes like Daredevil, Jessica Jones, Luke Cage, Iron Fist, Defenders. They're on the street, not this big cosmic battle. And so yeah, I like that they took their time with her relationships and what she's investigating and what she's doing, leading to that trauma. And if he can't learn, the only and there's a trolley question, right? The trolley problem is the only way you can stop him is killing him. Because he's going to keep manipulating and do it. Like if you're going to have to take him out, if you're against killing a life, but then what are you going to do? You're faced with that question. Just break his neck. Stop his mind control over you. You got to take him out.
Yeah. Yeah, no, the show was it was deep. It was hard. The Netflix shows, all of them, were very much like the Max comics. I feel like it's like we knew these were explicit. That's kind of part of the point, was to tell these darker stories. And I think he did a really good job of that. One thing I noticed, I mentioned how in the comics it kind of leaned more into her trauma around superhero teams and just team ups in general. The show, I really feel like, leans further into her personal trauma, like how it personally affects her in her relationships, in her mind, and just like existing. And like even questioning her own choices, like, am I doing this because he's telling me? Am I doing this because I want it? Like all that kind of stuff is a little bit more prevalent in the show, and I feel like it makes it harder to watch in some places. Like this is not a bingeable series. I feel like, for me anyway. Yeah.
No, it's heavy. It's existentially very heavy.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. Well, I want to talk about specific scenes in this that stood out to us, and this is part of what made me think this would be great for the Amipotence talk. And I want to give you guys a chance if any of the themes stood out to you. But for me, the one that stood out to me was the one episode where he basically sends out an invitation, and Jessica Jones was like, "Okay," and she goes to stay with him in a house, and he's trying to prove that he can be better, that he's not what she thinks he is, all this kind of stuff. And he does kind of a terrible job at it because what's revealed is like he literally doesn't know. Like if people are doing stuff because he's telling them or because they want to do it, and like because he doesn't really have control over his ability to control. And so you have that little bit of a paradox there in what happens to his own mind, like how warped that makes your mentality when you never know if someone actually loves you or not, and how having that kind of control causes him to treat humans as like just basically just stuff. Because like for him, there's not really any ever true relationship. So I think that just kind of dehumanizes everyone. And man, it makes you like, man, this guy is terrible, but like, is it his fault that he's terrible? That episode for me really stood out. Was there anything for you guys in this first season that where you were like, that's the scene, that's the story that really stood out to me?
Let's see. The stuff that stood out. I don't know. I kind of just want to pick up where you said, Josh, just because
That works too.
like I honestly, Killgrave lacks. I lack empathy or sympathy for Killgrave in a lot of ways, because, like you said, there's this sort of like, if he's born this way, which he is, or he's been experimented on, I guess, that sort of thing. Like, what point can you judge the nature versus nurture sort of a thing? But I think that there's not really any apologizing that happens. There's just more of like, okay, here's Jessica who's I've abused. How do I then, almost forcefully, to a certain extent,
Yeah.
Make myself better? And it's not about actually healing. It's about trying to make himself a better person at the expense of another. And I think that translates really well to like maybe even thought experiments on, can a god who has that ability, is there an incompatibility with the way that a god that maybe has similar traits that a Killgrave does, can they actually be compassionate if they don't know if they're controlling or not?
Yeah. Which you wrote a lot of similar stuff in the Amipotence article. I think everyone should get that book, as well as in your own Substack, Tolkien Pop. I actually wrote recently comparing like that kind of Calvinist version of guy that you see to, I don't think I compared him to Killgrave. I know I compared him to Sauron as well as the Master of Masters in Kingdom Hearts. And I'm like, if your God makes me think of these characters, probably not a great sign. Will, do you have anything to add to this kind of parts of stuff, or any scenes or anything that stood out from you from the show that you wanted to bring up, or maybe just fill us in with your wisdom? Is Killgrave capable of love or redemption?
No. Yeah, I think I I think, let's see, where am I looking for this? Anyway, I thought I created a banner. Anyway, I think, yeah, I'm of the mindset that anybody is redeemable, and there's always an open door for God's grace. In your outline, you said, is Killgrace capable of love or redemption? So there's even a typo. Killgrace. Yeah,
We're giving me so much stuff to edit. Let's stop this. Oh man, this won't come out for months.
but like, well, the redeemable, sure, but yeah, I think when we're talking about control, manipulation, and second guessing what is happening next in terms of how we use that, how we're stewards of that, I think there's a conversation for that, and creating villains where we're wrestling with those same questions, I think is important. So, yeah. Anyway.
Oh, you're not still talking. What was the last thing you said? I thought you would just keep going.
I don't know. I'm sorry. More editing. My internet's just so glitchy right now. I can't tell.
You were talking about redemption. You're talking about redemption, that there's room for that for people.
Okay, so Nick responded.
Yeah, I think that's true. The difference is that, Killgrave obviously isn't a deity in the show. Like, Killgrave is a human being. Actually, I don't know if he's like extraterrestrial or not. Isn't there? I don't remember.
Who knows?
He's a human, right? But he, there's room for that he can be redeemed and can do things that are better. But I feel like, especially in the show, it is clear that they've, at least with Jessica, that it's better that he isn't given the opportunity to, because he won't. Now, the comics are different. What happens to Killgrave in the comics, I think there's actually some empathy, because then there's a power dynamic where he himself is being controlled,
Yeah. 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 And that's, well, and that gets interesting too with the comics. And that's going to get into some of our last questions here. Even outside of just like the Alias story arc, you mentioned Will with Doctor Doom using him. I mentioned Kingpin uses him. I think you see a similar thing when we're transitioning to this. Like, how does love interact with this ability to control, and can there be a controlling, all-loving God? And we're also looking at, can a character who has the ability to control, is he capable of love? All these questions I think are entangled. And I think what's interesting is when you see something that can control others, other people try to control or to use that. So we see, Kingpin, Doctor Doom that do the Killgrave. In our real world, I think we see pastors and political figures try to use God to control others. So I think that's an interesting little bit of a parallel as well.
Yeah, I said in my sermon this past Sunday, I literally just talked to my congregation, said, I don't care if you believe in God or not. But I do care what kind of God you believe in and who you worship. And then I don't care if you believe in Christ, but I do care how you classify or define what messiahship looks like. And that kind of took people aback. It's like, there's a difference. You can just say you believe in God, believe in Christ, but what do you mean by that? And how do you use it, manipulate it, or commodify it? And I think where it was entangled with Killgrave is that he has this power, and how is he using it? And then he's even confused. There is some sympathy for the devil here, that like, oh, these TV shows set up the angst within you, who you support, and whether you pull who you pull for and who you pull against, and so they want you to have a little bit of sympathy for this villain, and you feel a little bit of it, but we're all longing for authentic connection and love, and then we just can't control ourselves to manipulate others because we're selfish in that nature. So I think if we personify God and put our own junk on top of how we understand God, then that will express how we preach about God, talk about God, write about God, because we're creating we create God in our own image.
Yeah, well, I'm going to say something that Tom Oord's going to push back on in that follow-up episode. But when I think about all this stuff, for me, I can bring in everyone as like the same side good guys when it comes to certain things. When we're thinking about like the ability to control, when we're talking about God, so I think Killgrave is a good lens to look through. But what we're really talking about is like, can love be controlling? And I would say no, because that's not a real relationship. What I think though is like interesting is like Nick and Tom would say no, God can't control. God doesn't have the ability to control. People like Christian Ashley, who's part of Systematic Ecology, good friend of all of ours, he would say God has the ability to, but God will not control people. I think that's what he would say. And I kind of fall into this like weird where I'm like, yeah, that God doesn't have that type of power. He has a different type of power, and love is his character. Love is not his power. His power is in relationships and how we choose to relate, and that's not always loving, I don't think, but I think God is love. It's weird. It gets into some of that weird like Levinas kind of, we aren't us, we are defined by our relationships. I would say the same thing's true of God. God is not just something out there. He is defined by relationships. So I think we're thinking of type, kind, whatever. I don't think it matters. I think the good guys are the ones on the side that say God is not controlling people. Whether it's because you think he can't or because he won't, doesn't matter so much to me. I think where you get into those dangerous territories, like what Will was talking about, is when we have pastors or political figures who are talking about a God who is going to control you. It has all this kind of stuff and use that to manipulate other people, that it becomes harmful. So I want to ask you guys, if it's actually harmful to have a doctrine of this controlling God in our churches, how do we interact with people who do believe in that version of God? Like what do we do with that? We can't just kill Killgrave in this instance because we would be going to a bunch of churches and burning them down, and I don't think that's right. Where are we at, though?
Yeah, it's hard to be a pacifist and anti-violence on top of those things, and how do you stop it, resist? But I just counter that narrative, share a different story of how we understand God to be or do. Yeah, you can disagree. Yeah. How do you counterbalance that narrative, or share a different story? How do you tell a different story, whether through your life or deeds or in the communities that you're entrusted with?
Yeah. Well, let's take a step back. Do y'all agree with me though? Like the idea that pushing that narrative of a controlling God is in fact harmful in our churches?
For me, it is. It is, and like Will was saying, like how do we then implement that or try to influence without ourselves becoming the domineering power we're trying to,
Yeah.
maybe stop being present. But I think so. In Tom's book, he talks about the political implications for promoting a God that's omnipotent, and where there is the possibility that this kind of top-down relationship is, like I said, more identity based rather than qualitatively based. Where it's God, so God, it's God, so no matter what happens, it's
Mm-hmm.
right. God ordained this to happen, therefore, what political leader does is therefore ordained and good. And so I would say the through the method that Will was talking about is how do we then create these counter narratives, promote them, so that we can see that sort of articulation of God is not in our best interests.
Yeah. So for me, how I'm going to answer my own question, I'm going to take more of a Taoist approach, and it's one of those things that I think Tom and I have disagreed on about a few times on Whole Church podcast, but not like a strong disagreement, just kind of like a emphasis disagreement, I guess. In the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu writes, and he says not to respect the clever. And what he talks about is like we put so much emphasis on knowledge and like building this stuff up that sometimes we confuse ourselves. We just make it all about all this stuff, and instead like just exist. And so how I would answer this is like, I think the problem is we have all this top-down nonsense, right? We have all these pastors saying, this is the will of God, this is what he says, and do this. And then to fight against that narrative, we have a lot of other pastors on the other side going, that's not what God said do this. And I'm like, well, I think all of that stuff is missing the point. And actually, God exists in relationships the same way all of us do. And just start making relationships. Just start loving people. It doesn't have to be like, I'm going to build a new theology. Just build those relationships, and since God exists in relationship, God will change it if God is real. And if God's not real, you're wasting your time anyway, so who cares? That's just where I'm at. Y'all want to push back against that? Say anything else before we wrap this up?
I think it's just like this. I think that even if God didn't exist, it would matter because it still affects the real life, It affects the real practical lives of people, where if God doesn't exist, then it just depends on like consensus or wherever someone kind of decides to put their trust as far as authority goes, where they're like, I like Trump, so whatever Trump decides to to trans people, like, then therefore it's fine. So anyway, but I think that's the only thing I'll say. But I do like the Taoist that connects to like Zen Buddhist kind of approach of like, instead of just creating systems which don't necessarily have lasting power anyway, that to just actually enact the love that exists in the world or the universe.
Yeah. And also, I think Tom does great at both of those. Not just because he's going to listen to this. Like, genuinely, seeing his pictures of nature and just how he reacts with me, even when I do disagree, like, he's just an incredibly loving person. So, I think the emphasis should be less on creating these structures and more on just building those relationships. I think if we loved people better, they'd be less likely to fall under Mr. Orange, as I like to call him, or President Orange, as it may be. playing off Mr. Purple. But yeah, Will, any last words before we wrap this one up?
No, I mean, I think the dilemma that Jessica Jones has at the end of the season when Killgrave is controlling all the people around him, and they're like, how do you stop them from fighting amongst themselves? We have to go to the source and stop that. And then, yeah, she kills him. But like, I think of like, yes, it's one thing to say just, well, let's pretend we're loving the world, we love each other and have understanding. But man, there are some people that are taking control and manipulating people, and people are fighting. They're creating harm with the community. How do you stop that? You know, there's one thing just to ignore or nonviolent resistance, but then there's another like how do you it's real big questions. It's nuanced questions like how do you stop this, and what does that resistance look like? Is it fight, take up arms, or is it to resist? Is it MLK, non violent sit-ins, non-violent resistance, unleash water hoses and dogs on you. It's complicated. It's not easy, but I think it's important us to continue to have these conversations about the character and nature of God and what we understand by love and all those things too.
Yeah. Well, then I'm gonna make a last pop culture tie-in and an episode I hope to do at some point. The politics of the Pixar film A Bug's Life. Where they do overcome their version of Mr. Orange through relationship. The ants learn that there's more of them. If they work in a relationship, that numbers defeat no matter how powerful the grasshoppers are. And it's a powerful political message that I think we need to talk about on like a primarily political episode or something one day, because it's a great movie, honestly. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here wrapping up our Mr. Purple talk. Thank you guys so much for joining us. This was a lot of fun. I know it was a big homework assignment, reading and watching, but I think it was a fun homework assignment. We're going to stay after a little bit to do an extra question for our patrons, which is just what would we do if we had Mr. Purple's power? So that'd be a fun one. But for now, though, we're going to give a recommendation for everyone. If you had to recommend a show, movie, comic book, literally anything, Will, what are you recommending for those listening or watching?
Go find Emperor Doom on Marvel Unlimited or Amazon. I think it's pretty expensive original copies, but Emperor Doom's big right now. He's hot. And then you have Mr. Purple. So see how Dr. Doom manipulates Mr. Purple for their own selfish reasons.
Yeah. Mine's going to be, if you got the time, go to YouTube, find the videos for Kingdom Hearts Unchained or Kingdom Hearts X, and literally just watch the story. It's not worth trying to play those games because they're mobile games. The story, however, super worth it. It's great. A lot of fun lore. Nick, what about you? What's a recommendation leave for everybody?
Keeping it with this kind of idea of power and things like that. The Buffy comics, the ones that are like the different seasons, exploring what it means for Buffy to be free from the Watchers. And there's this kind of interplay of like Buffy becoming an authority. Like, what does that mean? This interplay of power and what determines what's good and what's not. So yeah, the Buffy comics generally are pretty good past the show.
Well, I'm going to cheat and give another recommendation because you reminded me. Speaking of comics, graphic novels, stuff like that, they're finally making reprints of the old Dead Space graphic novels. So I just say, come in March. By the time this releases, they probably will have the first reprint of Volume 1 of the Dead Space graphic novels, and those are great stories, so check them out. I'm really trying to get more people on our show to check it out so I can do an episode about it, because it's fun. Guys, if you're on a laptop, please consider rating and reviewing our show, podcasts, good pods, all that kind of stuff. It will help our show gain recognition, make it easier to find in search engines like Google and those kind of things. If you're on your phone, consider rating, reviewing, or commenting on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. Either of those is going to help prioritize our show in those apps, algorithms, which is where most people listen to podcasts. So thank you guys so much in advance for your support and those 10 seconds of free support that you can give us with that little bit of time. And again, we want to thank our sponsors from Apple Podcasts, Captivate, and Patreon. Today, we're specifically shouting out Russell Gentry. We love you, Russell. And remember, if you like your own shout out, you too can support our show for $3 a month on one of those three platforms, Apple Podcasts, Captivate, or Patreon. And remember, we are all a chosen people, a geekdom of priests. Later. All right. Patron time. Bonus question, real quick, because Will has to go. What would we do if we had Mr. Purple's power? I'll let Will go first. What are you going to do if you had Mr. Purple's power, Will? I'm curious if you heard me.
Man, it's hard not to think about our current political situation, and there's certain people. I did. I'm sorry about my computer. Oh my gosh, it's so frustrating. Yeah, it's hard not to think about like our current political situation and certain people in the Oval Office that you would control and make them make different decisions. That's super hard.
Yeah, for me, like my instinct is like, oh man, I am taking over the HOA in my new neighborhood. It's gonna have all kinds of crazy rules. We're gonna have a butterfly garden, and it's gonna be great because it's gonna help the environment and the world. But then I'm immediately pushed back on myself, and I'm like, I feel like I wouldn't get satisfaction out of it because I want to know that people care enough about the world themselves that they would just choose to do it. So I just feel like I would hate having Mr. Purple's power because like I'm always like I want to believe that they're good in people, and if I had the ability to control people, I would never be able to know whether or not it's because people have good in them or just because I'm like, hey, they're doing what I want and I like that, you know. Nick, where are you at?
Yeah, I don't think on a large scale I would try to do it, because even if I had tried to use this power to do something good, like help people not starve, or help with the environment, like, is it real? Because what happens when I die and the power is not going? But what I use my power for would be kind of fun. So this is super silly, but I would have people like Musk or Trump or other powerful billionaires and people that I don't like. I'm a hairy guy, and sometimes I gotta shave my back, and it's really hard to reach. So I'm getting the people in power, and I'm going to make them shave my back as a point of humiliation, but also not actually doing any real harm. So
Yeah,
and it helps me.
I think because of my own conundrum of like not knowing if people are doing good because I told them to or any of that, I think I would actually probably just end up becoming like an isolationist, like hardcore. Like go to the public pool and be like, everybody leave. I don't think I did any harm, and I get to enjoy the pool by myself. Like I'm just like, you know what? Screw it. I'm now an isolationist, and I'm going to enjoy life by myself. I'd also see if it worked on dogs and get my dog to be a little bit quieter. Like, hey, you don't have to stop barking, but Copper, could you just bark a little less? Maybe that's it. I'll start pulling a Jesus and only talking to people in questions. Yeah, I'll learn to do that. All right, guys. Thank you, sponsors, for supporting us and listening to our nonsense. We love you. Nick, Will, I love you guys as well. And this was fun.
Love you too, dude.
Yeah. This was a lot of fun.